there are then two ways of manifesting. One comes with the ego's neediness to manifest, and another is out of the fullness of presence you can manifest. You, even coming from the fullness of presence, presence can use also the human mind, because presence can flow through the mind and can energize your thoughts, your thought structures, and they're no longer dysfunctional. And whatever presence wants to manifest through you, it can use the power of thought to manifest, but it will come from a giving behind. There is a desire to give, a wanting to give, not to get. So thought can be used, and it's used more powerfully when the ego is no longer interfering. But presence, when the human becomes co-creator with God, then presence can flow into the human mind and use also human thought and create original things out there. And that's a beautiful thing. And from presence you do not create because you want whatever that you create to satisfy you. Because you're creating out of the satisfaction, the fullness already, out of presence. So there's a joy. The reason for creating then is the joy of the doing, the joy of the act of creation. In the ego, you don't have that. It's not the joy of the creation, it's the stress of the creation. You may get moments of joy when momentarily the ego subsides for a moment, but then it comes back in again. So it's very stressful. Any endeavor that the ego undertakes becomes stress. It becomes conflict. If you look at organizations, and whenever egos come together and they have some big enterprise, even well-intentioned egos are still egos. And that's why the proverb applies, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's talking about the ego. And so you get even church organizations, and they really want to do good. And then look at the committees meeting, the church committee. They're all fighting each other. In many cases, not perhaps in all cases. Or wherever, look at hospitals, the administration of hospitals, a place of healing, potentially. Universities, a place of learning and wisdom, potentially. So there's nothing wrong with manifesting. Whether you come from ego, eventually you will become dissatisfied with whatever you create, and then you wake up. In the meantime, I'm not going to take away can hardly say pleasure, the pleasure pain that the ego has in creating. I would never dissuade anybody from saying, don't strive after material things, it won't do you any good. There's no point in saying that. Humans have to taste the truth of it for themselves. And so sometimes they have to go that way. But more humans are actually come into this world now that may not need to go through the full-fledged development of the egoic madness. There are more humans coming in now who perhaps will go through the egoic phase in their adolescence and then grow out of it when they become adults. And that perhaps would be a wonderful thing, because that's really how it should be. The egoic stage, a temporary stage of immaturity, of delusion that you go through as part of your growth into a fully conscious human being. So the universe wants to create. There's nothing wrong with creation, especially the creation that comes from the fullness of life. The universe also wants deep inner peace. It also wants, you also want, to be rather than to do, to return to the source. It's not the doing, it's wanting to be still. And really, this is what presence is. Presence is conscious realization of the source of all life. And that's what really the ego originally wanted when it was looking for something else. It really wanted to find that. When you are connected with the consciously connected with the source of all life, then the miraculous thing can happen. You can actually be in balance between dwelling in source awareness, which is the stillness, which is the presence, which is the awareness. Awareness is source itself, the light of consciousness, knowing itself as the light of consciousness. And that's a beautiful thing. And then you can continue to move in this world of form and allow the universe, the source, to create through you and participate in the act of conscious creation, if that's what you want. Or you can stay in the source and don't move again. This happened to me to some extent. It happened to Ramana Maharshi for several years when he was a young man, the same sage I just mentioned earlier. He went completely back to the source, into what is called self-realization, knowing himself as consciousness, as the self, and stopped speaking. Didn't want to speak anymore because that's doing. There was nothing to do. There was just dwelling in the source and delighting in the realization of oneness with the source. So he sat at the foot of by a temple and just had his delighting in source awareness. And he didn't eat anymore, because what was the point? And instead of taking him to a mental home, as they would have done in the West, some pilgrims who would regularly visited the temple would put food in his mouth. And he did swallow it. And after a few years, gradually, he came out again, and then gradually he began to interact again, and even words came back. And so there was the return journey, into a very extreme form of the return journey. And then he stayed there. He could have stayed there for the rest of his life. Cases like that have occurred, and it's not to us to either condemn or approve. It's just sometimes it can happen. I'm not pointing this out to you as necessarily a desirable thing for you here in the West, particularly. And he came out again, but he never lost connection with the source now, even when he began to speak. And then they asked him questions. He was relatively uneducated, they brought the ancient scriptures and asked, what does this mean? And he looked and said, well, obviously it means this and this and this. Oh. Immediately he could explain every scripture because he was dwelling in source. Presence itself was speaking through him. So he became a great sage, and without doing anything as such except speaking occasionally, an ashram grew up around him. So creation did happen to some extent through him. So the universe through him created the ashram. But he was really part of the, as every spiritual teacher is, the spiritual teacher really points the way back to the source.